Okay, well, welcome back to another bacterial disease. This one is originally called leprosy. Recently, it's been called Hansen's disease. Well, actually, recently since about the 1900s. And that is because the person who found the organism that caused leprosy was named Hansen. And leprosy definitely carries a certain stigma with it. So the thought was, well, let's rename it to Hansen's disease, and then it won't carry quite the stigma. So, what's going on? My slide isn't advancing. There we go. So weird. So leprosy or Hansen's disease is a chronic disease. It's a disease of the skin and the peripheral nerves. 95% of the world's population is naturally immune to this disease. So only 5% have the possibility of getting it. And again, it causes skin lesions. And then because it damages the peripheral nerves, it also causes sensory loss. And by having sensory loss, if you have it on your hands, it's very common on your extremities, not so much on your trunk. But if you have it on your extremities, like on your fingers, you're going to have sensory loss in your fingers. And then what happens is you may continually injure those parts, like, you're picking up something and it's hot, or your fingers may not tell you that it's hot. And so you're continually injuring those fingers. And then eventually, your tissue pretty much dies. And so it's called a natural amputation, because parts of you may fall off. It can also infect your eyes and cause blindness if it's there. So in the worst cases, you may lose your fingers or your toes, and that can be due to gangrene or an infection, or it can be, as I just described, regarding the disease. It can also cause blindness, as I just mentioned, and it can also collapse the nose. So again, this is a very vulnerable part. It's like your digits, it's exposed. And so it can, kind of chew around your nose, and, pretty much you're just left with flat face without a nose. So at the first part, it causes these kind of ulcerations or lesions. And then as we get back farther into the disease, it can also cause weakening of the skeletal frame. So here's on the upper left is a photo of some lesions of leprosy. They don't hurt, they don't itch. As a matter of fact, they have no feeling in them. So if you were to touch one of those large red macules there, then you would feel nothing. And that's a hallmark of it. So if you get a nodule or something like this and you can't feel anything, well, you probably want to go to the doctor. Okay, so later on, you can see this hand, and it has affected these fingers, and it's also affected the skeletal system of this particular person. So I mentioned Dr. Hansen. In 1873, Dr. Gerhard Hansen, the guy in the picture there, he was a Norwegian researcher, and Norway, oddly, was the last European country with a serious problem. And it kind of died out, or not died out completely, but they were not having major epidemics of it. But Norway did have a continuing problem, and he discovered the bacteria. It's a bacillus, so it's a long one rather than a circular bacteria, and it's called now Mycobacterium leprae. And so that's the causative agent, and it is very, very slow growing. The average incubation period, once you're exposed to it, let's say you got a little poke on your finger, or not a poke, but you have leprosy on your finger there, it's not going to show any damage for 5 years. And it can occur after a year, but it also may occur up to 30 years or even more. Like 5 to 10 years is kind of the average. 5 to 15 years is kind of the average, but you can tell that it's a very slow growing with a long incubation period. And there it is again. Whoops, did I miss something? Okay. So it is treatable with antibiotics now. And in this case, we have a quad image of a woman with leprosy on her face. And this is after treatment. Now, treatment has to last about 6 to 12 months because it does take quite a while for all of the leprosy, because it's slow growing. It also takes a long time for the drugs to kill it. So here the woman is at the start of when she had leprosy. She first went in to get her antibiotics. And then we have about probably 3 to 4 months later, then 6 to 8 months later, and then finally a year later. So it's incredibly disfiguring if you don't have antibiotics, which we didn't have until the 40s. So it was a very very not nice disease, and people were not nice about those who had it. So it is related to tuberculosis, but it's much harder to catch than tuberculosis. It is transmitted via droplets, and you have to have close contact with leprosy patients, and it's most likely through coughing or sneezing, and it could be from direct contact, but they do know that from the droplets you can get it, and you might get those on your body, or you might get them actually in your respiratory system. And as I mentioned, it can be cured with antibiotics. It's a multi-drug, so they do more than one antibiotic at a time. And as I mentioned, the therapy needs to continue for about 6 to 12 months. It is a very old, old disease. So the last Neanderthals and the first Homo sapiens probably had contact with Mycobacterium leprae. So it evolved, the disease evolved into what it is now, leprosy or Mycobacterium leprosy, about 100,000 years ago in Eastern Africa or perhaps Southwest Asia. India is a real hot spot, and they don't know, did it migrate there, with the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, or did it start there? So, when a disease is that old, it's kind of hard to tell the origin. But it did, however, travel along the routes that early humans took. So, early humans started likely in Africa. You can see the red area there. Homo sapiens appeared about 200,000 years ago. And then the red line is where humans traveled along the continents. And so you can see it goes up to the red line, or the red area kind of goes up to Southwest Asia. Or the Mediterranean. So, and then you can see how it traveled in lots of different ways. It went from the Asian continent to the African continent to the Asian continent, from Asia to Europe, and then Europe to the Middle East. And that was about 40,000 years ago. So a very old disease. The oldest skeleton found with erosions on the bone was found in India, and it was dated to be about 4,000 years ago. Obviously, when they didn't have antibiotics, the disease would progress, very extensively. And you can see here the toes. I don't know if you've taken anatomy or you've seen toe bones on a skeleton, but they don't look like this. These are very pointed, and they have been damaged by the leprosy bacterium. And so this actually was a fairly recent find within the last 10 years, where they found this skeleton. And then we do have some written records of leprosy. And one of the earliest was in 2000 BC, and that was in India, describing a disease that sounds like leprosy. Of course, we never know for sure if that is leprosy, because we can't examine the bacteria or even the patients. And then there was another written account around 1500 BC in Egypt. So another potential proof of the disease in those areas. So in ancient Greece, around 325 BC, Alexander the Great invaded India, and it's theorized that at that point, Alexander's troops carried it over to the Middle East. And then from there, the Crusaders were, invading or traveling at least to Muslim countries in the Middle East, trying to convert them to Christianity. And so they likely picked up, some of them picked up leprosy and carried it back to Europe. And that was between 11th and 13th century, something like that. And then after a long time, about 500 years ago, about when the colonists first started coming over in the 1600s, then the colonists and slaves who came from Africa might also have likely transmitted leprosy to the United States. And it's still found. Well, it was there was a lot of it found in the Louisiana area, and that was part of the entry of port for slave trades. And so probably a lot of people, not just not just African Americans, but a lot of the, you know, colonists in that area developed leprosy as well. And that continues. So as you have seen, it can be a very disfiguring and disturbing disease. So it was thought it might be a curse or it might be punishment from God. And that was a belief of many religions: Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, I think even Muslim. And then some people thought it was witchcraft or a curse, you know, or they put a spell on you. And then an interesting one in Zambia, they thought you got it from eating hippo meat. So they kind of outlawed the eating of hippo meat. And then some people said that you were blessed with leprosy so that you could suffer like Christ. And you, since you were enduring purgatory on earth, you would then go directly to heaven. Don't think that was it, but so throughout much of world history, leprosy was incurable and disfiguring. And so people were very afraid of lepers and they looked awful. So people were just horrified of it. And they thought that lepers were probably highly contagious. That's not true, obviously, but lepers were considered carriers of a disgrace. Either it was a curse, it was punishment from God, it was a, you know, whatever. And so they were stigmatized and shunned and treated very humanely throughout history and even today, so long ago, and probably even today, there are some that are discarded from society, and then they were excluded and put into quarantine colonies, oftentimes against their will. So this is a man in Central America who does have leprosy, and hopefully he's getting treatment now. So there was a leprosy pandemic in 11th century Europe. And again, that was likely due to the Crusaders bringing the disease back. And so they developed leprosy focused hospitals to accommodate these huge numbers of victims in 1200. So that's, you know, a couple hundred years, or couple hundred years, there was about 19,000 leprosy hospitals. They were called leprosariums. So that's a lot of hospitals, and they don't just have one. So you can see that this disease was spread quite a bit. And so, you know, if you were living during that time, it was like, get away from me because I don't want to get this disease. And there's so many of them that, you know, they thought it was being passed very easily. It was sometimes called the death before death, and this is really tragic. But sometimes leper masses were held after you were diagnosed with leprosy, and that was essentially your funeral. You were dead to the rest of society, and you were pretty much on your own. Your heirs could then claim your inheritance, and you were, like I said, you're basically on your own. You're a beggar on the street, essentially. And lepers were required to wear bells or clappers. That's a clapper there that you shake back and forth. You've probably seen those from like New Year celebrations. Or you needed to wear distinctive or colored garments. In this case, the fellow has on a blue shirt. I don't know what the colored was for lepers, but you know, probably varied from different reasons. They were also required to walk on a certain side of the street or the walkway, depending on the direction of the wind. So if the wind was blowing this way, you didn't want a leper over here. You wanted a leper downwind. So all the healthy people would walk on this side and the leper would walk on this side. And then most or all of their personal effects were buried or burned, even sometimes their houses. People would not live in their houses. So this picture here is a leper begging for alms, for money. And this was, let's see, 1425 image. And then, as I mentioned, they were shunned and forced to live outside society. In this image, the fellow on the right, you see he has his clapper. He's got a staff because he probably is starting to become less able to walk on his own. And he has a heart on his garment, its tunic there. So that was likely in a certain area. That was likely what you know, labeled them as a leper. And then on the left-hand side, the picture with the blue surrounding it, there's a regular kind of stained glass or leaded glass church window. It's a church. And then down at the bottom, there's something that's been carved out. And that window was for lepers. So lepers were not allowed to go in the church, but, you know, in order for them to still, the priest wanted them to still be a part of or to hear the word of God, if you will. And so they built special windows for them to actually stand outside, and they could listen or hear as best they could from outside. And the window in the center is the same thing. That's a leper's window. Horrible. All right, so let's talk about some of the previous treatments. As you know from the plague, that these are pretty wacky, but if you had it, you wanted to get rid of it, so you try just about anything. So snake venom, bee stings, and sacrifices even were made or tried to get rid of leprosy. And then drinking or bathing in blood kind of held on for a long time. In the Old Testament, they suggested you pour the blood of a sacrificed bird on the infected individual. And, there's a lot of people who believe in the Old Testament and take it seriously. So that treatment lasted a long time. A Swiss physician, Paracelsus, he suggested that they use lamb's blood. And then in the late 1700s, they used dog's blood. None of them worked, of course. And then medieval alchemists, that would be, the 11th to 13th century, they created a concoction that had gold. And they theorized that gold symbolized richness and purity, so that if you drank that, then you would gain the purity from the gold and the disease would stop. Middle Ages also, they would castrate men. They thought it would cure or prevent leprosy. It did not. And then leeches were used for a long period of time, probably from 14th or 15th century up to the 18th century, to bleed people. Remember, we're getting back to that miasma theory. Maybe that caused it, so they got to suck the blood out, and maybe that'll get all that bad toxic air out. So although it was pretty prevalent in the early Middle Ages, it declined after the Middle Ages. And the reason being that there were other more serious, quicker pandemics. So cholera, we just talked about that, and syphilis, bubonic plague, influenza, smallpox, all of those killed people within days. And so because this is a very slow growing disease, you might be here and then you're going to die in 30 years, let's say, but you get smallpox right here, so then you're gone. So it may not have officially died out, but we didn't see it as much. And because of that, it didn't spread as much because people died before the disease actually manifested itself, and so they were less likely to spread it. In the Hawaiian Islands, before Hawaii was a state, it was introduced to Hawaiians from visiting outsiders. They didn't have any immunity, and there was no prevention, obviously, and no treatment. And it got so bad that about 1 in 300 people were in the Hawaiian Islands were coming down with leprosy. And then it got really bad, and about 1 in 30 were developing leprosy. So King Kamehameha V proclaimed an isolation law. He established a leper colony you may have heard of. It's in Kalaupapa, Molokai. And it was established in 1866, and there were about 8,000 victims of leprosy or Hansen's disease that lived and died there. Excuse me. They were transported to the colony by boat in a cattle pen. They were forcefully taken from their homes, and they had no way to leave the colony. There were no boats there, and the walls of the cliffs were like 1,500 feet. Supplies only came to the island once a year. People were afraid of going there. And so it was a miserable life for them, just miserable. In 2008, there were still 24 people living there of the original lepers. And in 2015, 6 remained full-time. And of course, all these people from, the 1940s or 50s were all cured, but, they had nowhere they could go to. Their families had either gone or wouldn't have anything to do with them. So, they had made friends and, just lived there. So they stayed. Image on your left is a high view of the leper colony. You can see the structures that are there. There's also on the far left of that some houses, and those would have been the houses that the residents lived in. And on the right, you can see a little more close-up view of some of the structures. It didn't start out this way, but it was It was, well, let me get to this. Joseph Van Voister, or he was called Father Damien. He was a Belgian priest and he volunteered. He was a Franciscan priest and he volunteered to go to Molokai in May of 1873. And he found 800 people, or 800 people at the beginning, living in just horrible conditions. They were basically just living off the land. They made, rudimentary shelters out of materials that were there. And he served as their priest, and he worked really hard to try and improve the colony. He helped them build and obtain supplies for adequate shelter. He got warm clothing, medicine, building projects. He had people on the mainland or on the islands help to develop plans and then send supplies over. And he made improvements to food and water supply to actually provide a little bit of health to some of these unfortunate folks. And that picture is of him about the time he went over. He was in his 30s when he went over there. Within 3 years, he had contracted leprosy, and he was told he could leave, but he did not want to leave. He insisted that he stay and take care of these patients, even when he was exhausted and ill. And you can see him there amongst lots of children. These are leprosy patients, and they're not always all adults. And so he stayed for until his death to help take care of these people. Here is him near his death, probably a couple years before his death. He died on April 15th, 1889. He spent 16 years there, and he was 49 years old. And his death was conclusive proof that leprosy was communicable. In other words, it was contagious, because he wouldn't have got it if it was a hereditary disease, right? Unless, unlikely, or any other kind of thing. So that gave credence to the fact that it was some kind of infectious agent. Some good things that came out of that. In 1881, Damien was appointed as Knight Commander of the Royal Order of Kalakaua, who was the king at the time. And in 1965, he was nominated by Hawaii for a place of honor in the National Statuary in Washington, D.C. And he was then canonized by Pope Benedict the 16th in 2009. And he's considered a patron saint for people afflicted by leprosy and also patron saint of the state of Hawaii. So a remarkable man. A remarkable woman who was around at that time with him. Her name was Mary Ann Cope. She was born in Germany. Her family immigrated to the United States when she was about 2 years old. And in 1862, she joined the Sisters of Third Order of St. Francis in Syracuse, New York. In around the late 1800s, 1880s, maybe early 1880s, 1885, Father Damien had requested help, and so her order, well, actually many orders got this call in asking for help, and so she and a couple others, 6 others, actually volunteered, and they went to Honolulu and set up a screening area for the lepers, and then after that, in 1888, she and 2 of those 6 sisters went over to Molokai to help care for the lepers there. Her goal was to open a home for unprotected women and girls. And then some other things she did, she introduced cleanliness, pride, and fun to this colony, which is a wonderful thing. She sewed bright scarves and pretty dresses for the women. She had, she implemented, fun activities like, maybe not dances, but something where they could get together and, and have fun together and actually try and have a bit of a normal life. And then she too was awarded the Royal Order of Kapiolani by the Hawaiian government, and she was made a saint of Molokai, Saint Mary Ann of Molokai, in 2012. And she is the patron saint of lepers, outcasts, those with HIV and AIDS, and the Hawaiian Islands. So here's a little thing that one of the children who was swept away or stolen in the night or whatever wrote. It's a quote from him. "One of the worst things about this illness is what was done to me as a young boy. First, I was sent away from my family. That was hard. I was so sad to go to Kala'apula. They told me right out that I would die here, that I would never see my family again. I heard them say this phrase, something that I'll never forget. They said, this is your last place. This is where you are going to stay and die. That's what they told me. I was a 13-year-old kid. Horrible, just horrible. So you think that, okay, that wasn't the Hawaiian Islands wasn't a state then. So, the United States isn't so bad. Well, guess what? We're just as bad. So as I mentioned earlier, there was leprosy, was fairly well established in the American South. So in Carville, Louisiana, in 1894, 7 New Orleans with Hansen's disease were forced onto a barge that traveled up the Mississippi River. They were forced at gunpoint in the middle of the night. They were taken upriver to the site of an abandoned home. It was a plantation, the Indian Camp Plantation, and they had to stay there. They were forced to just live in this area. It was purchased by the state about 10 years later, and they expanded it to allow more patients to be kidnapped and brought there. Sorry, but it's kind of what it was like. So when they arrived, it was a swampy, malaria-prone territory outside of Baton Rouge. They were initially housed in former slave cabins. And as you probably know, slave cabins were not luxurious. So they shivered, they sheltered, they got malaria in addition to leprosy. Fences divided the men's sides from the women's side, and all interactions between the sexes were strictly forbidden. There was a tall iron perimeter fence to prevent escape attempts. And there was an on-site jail to punish people who did try and escape or who actually did escape. And they were sometimes brought back in leg irons or leg chains. Upon arrival, they were strongly encouraged to take a new name, to make up a fake name for themselves, because that would help to protect their families from the stigma of them having leprosy. So their families obviously gave them up, and I just don't know about that. So then the US government implemented a policy of segregating those with leprosy. In 1917, they bought the property, and they named it the Louisiana Leper Home at Carville. And they too deprived all of these citizens of their fundamental rights. They were not allowed to work outside of the community. They couldn't move around freely. They couldn't see their loved ones. They couldn't vote. They couldn't leave. Some, when they had babies, even though male and female were separated, that didn't last always. Some of them had their babies forcibly removed and sent to orphanages or to be adopted by another family. And this is the bill, the Senate Bill 4086, that was implemented in 1916, wherein, the United States established this leper home in Carville, Louisiana. This is what it looked like. Well, after they got there, after a short time, the sisters, like Sister Marianne of Molokai, the Franciscan sisters, sent some nurses there. And so they came in to help care for the patients, but conditions were deplorable there, even for the nurses. I mean, they were all given hatchets so that they could kill the water moccasins that came into, the cottonmouths that came into their rooms, because those are poisonous snakes, obviously. And there were the floorboards, you could see through the floorboards, and animals and stuff, rats and raccoons and possums, stuff all kind of came into the house. And anyway, it just sounds really miserable. So this is what it looked like. On the picture on the right is the plantation home when they first got there or shortly thereafter. And unfortunately, the fight to control Hansen's disease was directed against patients rather than against the disease, as I've just shown you. The way that they're handling this is they're just trying to shun and sequester all of the people who have Hansen's disease rather than concentrating on how are we going to cure this? What are we going to do? So even doctors, the United States government, they were just trying to get rid of them. And so then, as I mentioned, 4 Daughters of Charity nuns came over in 1896, and they started to lobby for money and help. And so they were able to restore the plantation home, and then the occupants were allowed to move into that home rather than the slave quarters. So this is Indian Camp Plantation. This is it, I think it's probably in about the 1960s. but they did do a remarkable job of restoring it. I don't know that it looked this good in 1900, but it did eventually get a lot better. So later at Carville in 1931, so this isn't that long ago. This is, probably your great grandparents. In 1931, an enterprising patient, Stanley Stein, that was a pseudonym. Remember, they changed their names. He worked to try and reduce the stigma of leprosy. He created a newspaper called The Star, and he had articles written in it, written by the patients, and it was mailed to readers around the world. And they tried to give readers a look at what was happening at Carville, and to, here the quote is better than I can say it, to radiate the light of truth on Hansen's disease. These were just people who were suffering. They were not bad. They weren't cursed. They weren't, they were as horrified of their disease as anyone else, probably more so because they were suffering the stigma of it in addition to what they looked like and felt like and all of that. And then eventually patients opened up some businesses there. They had a hair salon, they had a photography studio, they had orchid cultivation, a carpentry shop, a laundromat, and a couple of restaurants, sandwiches, and Chinese food. And the patients eventually could work at the hospital, work in the canteen or the cafeteria, and they could also work in the school. So life became a little bit better for them after the 1930s and 1940s. It did receive patients from around the world, and eventually the nuns established yearly cultural events. I don't want to say this, the nuns, because additionally there were more medical personnel who came in, nursing staff, physician staff, etc. Um, uh, and so they helped to establish some of these cultural events. So they had Mardi Gras, and in Mardi Gras they had a parade. The patients built floats. They passed her throughout doubloons, and they had armadillos on them, which you'll know about in a minute. And then they had a ball. They had a Mardi Gras ball, and they had a king and a queen of the ball. And they also celebrated Chinese New Year. And then Dr. Guy Henry Faget, excuse me, who was the hospital director, pioneered the use of sulfone drugs. And this halted the progression of the disease. So these drugs, sulfate, was just coming into knowledge, and penicillin as treatments, as antibiotics, in the late 30s and 40s. And then, of course, a lot more drugs after that in the 50s and 60s. But they didn't know what would work, but he pioneered this, and it did halt the progression of the disease. And so the patients, if they received a certain series of negative skin tests, then they would be allowed to leave Carville. And some of them did, some of them didn't. So it's not a just an ancient disease. It is still a current disease. In 1980, there were about 5 million cases globally. Now that number has significantly improved, but it's still a problem. At the end of 2021, the World Health Organization had reported 133,000 cases, which is about 17 per million in the population. However, they also say that that number is probably 15 to 20 times higher than that, because people don't report it. They're afraid to report it. They don't go to their doctor, whatever. A lot of reasons. Again, there's still that stigma of leprosy. And this disease primarily affects underprivileged. And so obviously third world countries are at huge risk, as are underprivileged areas of Europe and United States, etc., because they have less access to health care. There's overcrowding and poor sanitation and poor nutrition. And then the worst of all is that this isn't a glamorous disease, and they don't have a lot of people to fight for it, right? Like like when HIV came out, that was terrible, and I think every dollar that goes to that, or Alzheimer's, every dollar that goes to that are worthwhile. But there's no one who's really going out there saying we need to cure leprosy, and so a lot of that money goes to other causes, cancer, and HIV and Alzheimer's, and all kinds of other diseases, and this just gets less attention and therefore less money. And sadly, discrimination is still a big part of it. Discrimination against people affected by leprosy from the World Health Organization was reported 124 times in countries, Brazil, Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Kiribati. And then this one's a real killer. 5 countries, China, India, Iran, Japan, and Togo, have laws that allow discrimination based on leprosy. Okay, as a healthcare provider, that's just disgusting to me. But obviously, I can't change the world. So I told you I'd tell you about armadillos. Armadillos are the only known animal host. And because of that, leprosy, not only because of armadillos, but partly because of armadillos, it remains a public health concern. And then, in the United States, and from 1994 to 2011, there were a little over 2,000 new cases and an average annual incidence of about 0.45 cases per 1 million. So, about one case per every 2 million people. So not really very common in the US, but if you're one of those, it's an important disease. And here is something I thought was very significant when I was doing some research for this. This is an article in The Hill, which is a newspaper based in Washington, D.C., and it was written by Dr. Mark Siegel, who is a professor and physician at New York University. And it seems only a matter of time before leprosy could take hold among the homeless population in an area such as Los Angeles County, with close to 60,000 homeless people and 75% of those lacking even temporary shelter or adequate hygiene and medical treatment. All of those factors make a perfect cauldron for a contagious disease that is transmitted by nasal droplets and respiratory secretions with close, repeated contact. That's scary. So that's leprosy or Hansen's disease. Thanks so much for listening.